In a country scarred by silence, one woman, Aminata, walks into power with nothing but dust on her feet and fire in her voice. For 39 years, they ignored her. In just 3 minutes, she made them listen. This isn't about revenge. It's about remembering. But what truth was buried deep enough to shake a nation when finally spoken? The air inside the crystal ballroom of the Grand Meridian Hotel was thick with power. Everything sparkled: the chandeliers, the polished marble floors, the name tags clipped to designer suits. Men and women from around the globe swirled martinis, exchanged cards with 3 languages printed on them, and laughed the rehearsed laughter of those used to owning things they've never touched. On the main screen, the words Global Mineral Futures Summit pulsed in deep gold. Below it, a scrolling ticker displayed stock prices and the logos of the corporations funding the next big extraction project, a mining operation in Burkina Faso's Central Plateau, rumored to contain billions in rare metals. Near the stage, a European CEO in a gray silk suit tapped impatient fingers on the table. He was waiting for the next speaker to present a slideshow on projected yields. He didn't care about the land, only the numbers. Then a sound broke the rhythm. Not a loud noise, just different. Sandals. Flat, dusty sandals stepping softly on marble that had known only heels and polished shoes. The click-click of professionalism was pierced by the shh of cloth brushing against itself. Heads turned instinctively. She had no badge. She had no blazer. She had no place, not here. A woman stood just inside the double doors, dark-skinned, elderly, dressed in a long flowing wrap. Burnt orange and clay red swirled across her fabric like desert winds in motion. Her scarf tied high, proud, shimmered with hints of deep blue and gold. On her shoulder hung a woven bag frayed at the edges, bulging slightly. A corner of yellowed paper peeked out. She said nothing. She didn't need to. The silence she brought with her weighed heavier than any words. At the head of the room, the CEO stood, slowly at first. Then sharply he slammed his palm against the table, with a sound that made even the waitstaff jump. "Who let this peasant in?" He barked, his voice loud and theatrical. The laughter came in waves, polite chuckles at first, then bolder, meaner ones. A few delegates reached for their phones, already filming the incident. One whispered, "Well, this just went viral," nudging his colleague with a grin. "Is she with catering?" someone asked. "Maybe she's here to clean another," said mockingly. "Maybe she's lost. Maybe she's dangerous." A security guard moved toward her hesitantly. His hand hovered near his belt, unsure whether to grab a walkie-talkie or her arm, but she didn't flinch. She simply looked forward, not at him, not at the CEO, but into the room, as if she saw something deeper than decor. The CEO took a step toward her now with open mockery. "This is a restricted international conference," he sneered. "Diplomats, executives, not—" He motioned at her with disgust. "Squatters." Still, she said nothing. Her hands remained calmly folded before her, her shoulders square. She stood like someone used to waiting but not used to begging, and that made them uncomfortable. The CEO leaned closer, lowering his voice but not his contempt. "If you don't leave right now, I'll have you removed, permanently." The security guard looked at her again, then at the CEO, then back. The woman, without breaking eye contact, reached slowly into her worn bag. The room stiffened. The guard stepped back slightly. One man whispered, "What if it's a threat?" Another chuckled nervously. "Please, it's probably a list of grievances." From her bag, she pulled a small white envelope. It was creased, slightly smudged from fingers that had held it often. But at its center gleamed something unmistakable. The red wax seal of the presidency. Clean. Pressed. Intact. She didn't wave it. She didn't speak. She simply held it up. The laughter stopped. Completely. In the back, a young soldier, barely out of training, turned to his superior, whispering, "Commander, I think that's the president's mother." The commander's body stiffened, as if the marble beneath them had suddenly become lava. Sweat appeared at his temple. His mouth opened. But no words came. The CEO, oblivious, scoffed. "A prop, a joke." He chuckled, but it sounded thin. "What's next? She owns the mines." But now no one laughed. Now! The room was watching. The woman, still wordless, stood like the eye of a storm. And no one was sure anymore if they were looking at a nobody or a reckoning. The envelope didn't move. Neither did she. Her arm was extended steady as stone fingers curled beneath the weight of wax and truth. No one dared approach. At first the room tried to pretend it still had control. A few delegates coughed. One muttered, "Surely just a prank, maybe a street protester." But their voices wavered. The sharp edge of confidence had dulled into something thinner, fragile. The laughter from moments ago now hung in the air like smoke after a fire stale out of place and a little shameful. The CEO let out a dry chuckle forced. "I've seen this trick before," he said, waving a dismissive hand. "A stamp doesn't make a letter real." Still, he didn't take a step forward, and neither did anyone else. Instead, it was a voice from the back that cracked the tension. "Commander," the young soldier repeated, eyes wide, now whispering, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "I'm telling you, that's her. That's Aminata Urago." The name floated through the air like a spark landing in dry grass. The older officer turned his head slowly, finally focusing on the woman with a mix of dread and reverence. His spine straightened. The way a man's body changes when memory collides with recognition. It was the kind of stiffness that doesn't come from rank, but from fear of being irreversibly wrong. "She's not supposed to be here," the commander muttered, though it sounded more like a prayer than a protest. The young officer took a cautious step forward. His boots tapped lightly on the marble as he approached the woman who still hadn't spoken. He stopped a few feet from her, his throat dry. "Ma'am, may I see the letter?" She didn't flinch, didn't blink. Her eyes remained locked ahead, not on him, but on something bigger, as though she wasn't standing in this room, but on the edge of a much older one. Only when the officer extended both hands respectfully did she lower the envelope into his palms. It was heavier than he expected. He glanced down. The wax was real crimson and pressed deep with the official crest of Burkina Faso. The script on the front wasn't handwritten in haste. It was formal, neat, presidential. He turned to his commander and held it out. The commander read silently for a moment, and then his eyes widened. A soft, involuntary curse slipped from his lips before he passed the letter to the nearby journalist. "Read it," he said. His voice was low, tense, absolute. The journalist, an older man with silver glasses and a badge that read, "Le Quotidien, Afrique," adjusted his mic, cleared his throat, and began to read aloud. "To whom it may concern," he said slowly, carefully, as if each word were a thread holding the room together. "This letter grants full access to the Mining Futures Summit to Madame Aminata Urago, who speaks on behalf of the Office of the Presidency and carries discretionary authority from my desk." He paused, eyes scanning the bottom of the page, then swallowed hard. "Respectfully, Ibrahim Traore, President of Burkina Faso." A gasp swept the room. Not loud, but collective. A breath drawn in unison by over 200 people who just realized they were standing in the middle of a story that would outlive them. The CEO stumbled a half step backward, his mouth open. "No. No, that's not. This is a setup, a forgery, a stunt." But no one echoed him now. The envelope had shifted the axis of the room. The balance of power once built on dress codes, gatekeepers, and seating charts had cracked beneath the weight of an old woman in orange. Someone in the back, perhaps, a UN official, perhaps a hotel staffer, whispered, "Is she really his mother?" Another answered, "She raised him when his father was taken. I heard the story. Everyone in the capital knows it." In the front row, an analyst from Geneva fumbled with her phone. She had been live tweeting conference highlights, but now her hands trembled. The last thing she had posted was a photo of the CEO. She deleted it without hesitation. Aminata remained still. The light from the skylight above caught the edge of her scarf and threw a golden shimmer across her cheek. She didn't move toward the podium. She didn't speak. She just stood, not waiting for permission, not asking for understanding, just being. And in that stillness, the room, so used to noise and dominance, found itself held hostage by the presence of someone it had misjudged. Some began to shift in their seats. Others looked away ashamed. The man who had laughed the loudest minutes ago now stared at the floor. It was no longer a question of if she belonged. It was now a question of why she had come, and what she would say next. The room was caught in a fragile silence, as if a single sound might shatter the illusion of control still clinging to the walls. The CEO, red-faced, cornered, and desperate to recover his throne, pointed a stiff finger toward her and scoffed louder this time, trying to regain the audience he no longer owned. "She's got no shoes that match," he barked, forcing a sneer. "No badge. No title. This isn't a public park. This is a summit for decision-makers. What next? Do we let in street vendors with flyers?" A few delegates chuckled, more out of habit than humor. The laughter no longer rang with confidence. It ricocheted off guilt. Several eyes flicked back to the envelope, as if afraid it might burn straight through the table. The woman didn't respond right away. She simply stood, her arms folded gently in front of her, the fabric of her wrap soft around her elbows. The light caught in her scarf again, weaving gold through the deep blue. Her sandals, cracked and worn, stood steady on a floor she had once cleaned on her knees. She looked directly at the CEO, not with anger, not even pity, just calm, almost tender clarity. And when she spoke, her voice was low, nearly a whisper, but every syllable reached the walls. "I didn't come to be seen," she said, her eyes still on him. "I came for the truth." The words didn't need to be loud. They didn't need punctuation or performance. They landed like a stone dropped into a quiet well, echoing all the way down to where people forgot there was depth. Behind her, a few whispers rippled again. Someone near the security desk muttered in French, uncertain. Another staff member glanced nervously toward the press row. From the far side of the room, a man in a dark blazer leaned into his colleague and whispered, "She hasn't even asked for a microphone." "She doesn't need one," the other replied. Near the podium, the conference organizer, a tall man with wire-frame glasses and a fraying headset, turned toward his assistant. His voice trembled slightly. "Get the seal verified. I don't care how fast, do it now." The assistant nodded and vanished toward the back corridor, but the woman did not move. Instead, she closed her eyes briefly. Just for a moment, and in that pause, something else flickered through the room. Not fear, not politics, but memory. Not just hers, but something older. Something shared. It was as if her silence itself carried weight, as if it held the echoes of barefoot children by broken rivers, the last breath of men whose names never made it to reports, the strength of women who had buried sons and still rose before dawn to light the fire for tea. It was the kind of silence that didn't beg to be broken, only respected. The CEO, sensing the attention slipping again, tried one more time to claw it back. "This is absurd," he snapped, though his voice now sounded too loud, too rehearsed. "She's playing dress-up with national symbols. This is manipulation." The soldier beside her, young, unsure, but now visibly shaking, took a slow step forward. His voice was soft but resolute. "She's not playing, sir," he said. "That envelope is real." Then with a deliberate movement, he straightened, placed a hand to his chest, and saluted. The room fell silent again. He held the salute firm, not to the president, not to the flag, but to the woman standing beside him. "Madame Aminata," he said, voice steady now, "we await your word." And with that, the room finally understood. She hadn't come to ask permission. She had come to remind them who gave it, before her name passed between diplomats like a warning, before guards saluted her with trembling fingers, before she stood unshaken in front of men with wealth stitched into their suits. Aminata Urago scrubbed floors. Not metaphorically, literally. Every morning before the city stirred, before birds cried over rusted roofs, before flags rose and languages collided at marble conference tables, she knelt on tile floors with a metal bucket and a brush worn to half its bristle. The same floor she stood on today. The same chandeliers above, now dimmed for international meetings, once cast judgment on her skin like sunlight through stained glass. She was invisible, which in that place meant useful. She had a rhythm, left hand to balance, right hand to scrub a half-hummed melody under her breath that helped pass the hours. But she never spoke. Not unless she was spoken to. And even then her words were small, tidy, measured like rice on ration days. One morning, as she wiped a streak of red dust from the brass doorknobs, two men in Western suits walked past her without slowing. One of them, French by accent, dropped a half-finished cigarette onto the newly cleaned tile and said loud enough for her to hear, "They clean better than they speak." The other laughed. They didn't look at her, not really. Just the idea of her, the help, the brown figure blending into the walls. She didn't flinch. She just knelt, pinched the cigarette between two fingers, and carried on. That was how silence worked back then. It didn't mean absence, it meant survival. She'd been working there for 5 years. The hotel, once a colonial governor's palace, had been privatized, painted, and priced for foreign hands. It was still called Le Méridien, but no one remembered why. Her uniform had changed over the years from gray to cream to beige, but her pay hadn't. Nor had the way she was expected to lower her gaze when important guests passed by. Back then she had a husband, tall, strong, eyes too honest for his own good. His name was Musa. He was a teacher in the village of Tong Hin, not far from the capital. He taught children how to write their names in chalk and how to ask why. That was his mistake. He asked why. Why the local clinic never had medicine. Why foreign trucks moved in without telling farmers. Why the national anthem played louder when investors visited. Why the flags above the mines didn't match the flags of the children buried nearby. Then one night the soldiers came. It wasn't loud. That's what she remembered most. Not the shouts, but the silence. Boots on dry leaves, the clink of buckles, the way her lantern flickered when the wind changed. They didn't bother to knock. The door wasn't locked. Why would it be? She stood in the doorway, wide-eyed, with Musa behind her shirt, half-buttoned, chalk dust still on his hands. The soldiers gave no names. They offered no charges. Just a phrase delivered like a verdict, accused of agitating. Asking the wrong questions, Aminata begged. "Let him say goodbye to his son," she whispered. "He's only 5. He won't understand." They didn't answer. They simply took him. The door slammed shut behind them, but her knees remained there folded on the floor long after sunrise. The next morning she went to work, not because she was ready, but because there was no other way to afford bread. Her supervisor said nothing when she arrived, just handed her a mop and pointed to the West Wing. Nobody ever asked what happened to Musa. No one offered condolences, because to do that, they'd have to admit they knew his name. So Aminata said nothing. She folded her grief into corners. She wiped her husband's absence off the marble like it was dust. She whispered stories into her son's ears at night, stories about trees that held their roots even when the storm came. And in the ballroom where decades later cameras would pan to her face, she had once scrubbed a coffee stain in silence while 2 men signed a contract that would strip her village of its land. Back then, her voice was worth less than the ink on that page, but she remembered everything. And now, so many years later, she had returned. Not with soap and rag, but with memory folded in an envelope. After Musa was taken, the house changed. It didn't shrink, but it felt smaller, quieter in a way that made Aminata's bones ache. The clay walls still stood, the roof still leaked when it rained, and the woven mat still rolled out each night. But without his voice, the space between things grew wider, emptier. In the dim corner of the room, a small boy sat cross-legged beside a wooden box that served as both table and bookshelf. His name was Ibrahim, 5 years old, quiet like the dust, but his eyes held something older than he was allowed to carry. Aminata knelt beside him, holding a lantern in one hand and a thin reader in the other, its pages curled and stained, passed down through too many hands before reaching hers. They studied at night because that was the only time she had. After sweeping alleyways, after peeling cassava for market vendors, after carrying buckets of water 3 hills from the village tap. She never complained, and neither did he. Her finger traced each letter slowly, softly. A, B, C, he echoed, her lips pursed, voice steady. Even when he stumbled, she never corrected with harshness, just silence. A silence that gave room to grow. By the time he was 6, he could write his own name. By 7, he was copying entire proverbs. By 8, he could quote his father's favorite saying by heart. They may take your ground. Don't let them take your word. When there was no candle, they used the lantern. When there was no lantern, they used moonlight. And when there was no light at all, she made him repeat lessons from memory over and over until the dark itself began to listen. Each morning, Ibrahim walked barefoot to school, a tattered satchel over one shoulder and a plastic bottle of rainwater in the other. He passed by the same guards who had once refused to name his father. He passed the same fence where foreign trucks rumbled through without slowing. He kept his head up, always. Aminata patched his clothes with thread from old curtains. She lined his sandals with flattened maize husks. When a teacher once remarked, "This boy asked too many questions," she smiled quietly and replied, "Then you should have prepared better answers." But her greatest lesson was never written. She taught him at the threshold of their home the morning he returned from school, bruised another child had mocked his torn shorts and muddy toes. She knelt before him, wiped the dust from his knees, and held his face in both hands. "Speak the truth," she said, voice low but firm, even if your voice shakes. That sentence would follow him for the rest of his life. Years later, he would write it in the first page of a leather-bound journal given to him by an uncle. Years after that, it would appear on campaign posters across the nation. Not because it was strategy, but because it was memory. At 12, he was accepted into the National Cadet Training Program. Most children celebrated. Ibrahim stayed quiet. His eyes had grown sharper, shoulders broader, but he still looked back one last time as they walked toward the bus depot. Aminata had packed him a bundle, 1 bar of soap, a folded wrap cloth, a photo of his father, and 3 dried oranges. She didn't cry. She never cried in front of him. But just before he climbed aboard, she reached into her bag and handed him something else, a photograph, creased, faded, but carefully kept. It was of him, at age 10. Standing barefoot in front of their house arms, stiff at his sides, jaw-clenched, eyes defiant. Dust clung to his shins and one sandal strap was broken. But his stance was unmistakable, the beginning of something. A lion still small but learning to roar. That photo had never been shown in public, until today. At the mining conference, the young officer beside her held it now. His fingers trembling, he turned it over. Scrawled on the back in neat black ink was one line. He promised me he would never let the land be sold to men who never tilled its soil. The officer stared. He knew the face. And suddenly he understood exactly who she was. The parade ground shimmered beneath the mid-morning sun. Rows of cadets stood straight in olive uniforms, boots polished to mirror the dust they'd once walked through barefoot. The national anthem echoed over loudspeakers, rising and falling, like a tide too proud to retreat. Spectators sat beneath white tents, clapping at the correct times, shielding their eyes with folders and fans. Aminata stood at the very back. Not because she wasn't invited closer, but because she didn't want to be seen. She wore the only dress she had left from the old days, a faded orange wrap cloth that had once belonged to her mother, now washed so many times. The color had softened into something warm and quiet. She stood behind a pillar, hands clasped in front of her chin, held high, eyes steady. And in the center of the parade, among the rows of saluting cadets, stood Ibrahim. Taller now, shoulders square, jawline sharp. But the fire in his eyes hadn't changed. He wore his uniform like it had been stitched into his very skin, not handed out like ceremony. He didn't search for her in the crowd, not yet, but she knew he felt her there. One by one, the names were called. Cadets stepped forward, received stripes from senior officers, saluted the flag, then returned to formation. Applause rose and fell like waves. Then came his name, Ibrahim Traore. He stepped forward with precision boots hitting the pavement, with the kind of purpose that cannot be taught. The general waited with outstretched hand. The camera crews panned in. And then it happened. He did not salute the flag. He did not salute the general. He turned, slowly, deliberately. His eyes scanned the edge of the tented crowd until they found her Aminata standing alone in the sun, and he raised his hand, a full, proud salute. To her. Gasps whispered through the crowd. The general blinked. A journalist muttered, "Is he?" and then scribbled faster. Aminata didn't wave, didn't cry. She only nodded, a small silent movement, like a stone dropped into deep water, but her spine straightened just a little more. That evening, after the ceremonies ended and the cadets dispersed into celebratory crowds, Ibrahim found her by the gates. No cameras, no press, just mother and son under a sky dimming with purple clouds. He hugged her tightly, whispered, "Ma, I didn't forget." And she answered, voice steady, "Then remember this, my son, never sell what we buried in silence. Never trade our soil for their signatures." He nodded once, eyes burning. And she said the words that would echo long after she was gone, "I will never sell this land silence, and you must never let them dig through our bones and call it business." In that moment, there were no uniforms, no titles, no flags. Just a mother's promise, and a boy who swore to carry it like armor. The hallway just outside the summit floor pulsed with quiet urgency. Phones buzzed in back pockets. Security radios hissed with clipped orders. Delegates shuffled papers, casting glances toward the double doors like children waiting for a storm they'd only heard about. They didn't know what was coming, only that something had shifted. And in the middle of it all, Aminata stood completely still. Not out of defiance, not even out of patience. She stood as if she had already endured every kind of waiting. And then came the clipboard. A young man in a navy blue uniform badge, shining too brightly for someone so nervous, stepped forward and held it out in front of her like a shield. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, trying to sound authoritative, but the crack in his voice betrayed him. "This floor is restricted to high-clearance guests only. I'm going to need to ask you to step aside." She didn't. He cleared his throat louder this time. "You're not on the guest list." Aminata didn't raise her voice, didn't raise her hand. She simply looked at the badge on his chest, then at the floor beneath their feet, its marble still gleaming, despite the years. Then her eyes found his again, and she answered calmly, like someone recalling a fact too obvious to argue with. "This floor used to shine because I scrubbed it." The words landed like dust settling on glass. Quiet but impossible to ignore. The young officer blinked, caught off guard. "I used to clean this very hall," she continued, eyes never leaving his. "Before the suits came, before the polished briefcases and name tags, before any of you knew what this place was worth." A pause, then her voice softened. "Back when no one asked for my name, only that I moved quietly." The clipboard in the officer's hand faltered just slightly. Around them, the hallway seemed to lean in. A woman in a headset near the media desk stopped typing. Two local soldiers standing guard at the side door exchanged glances. One staffer whispered something too softly to hear. Another reached for his phone and began recording. The tension didn't explode. It simmered, thick, heavy, and crawling up the walls. The young officer straightened, adjusting his posture to salvage control. "Madam, even if you used to work here, I'm afraid that doesn't grant you access today. There are protocols. We can't just—" "I know your protocols," she interrupted, still calm. "I remember when they were first written, and I remember who they were written for." She stepped forward, not aggressively, but with a gravity that made space for her without asking. The young officer instinctively stepped back. She turned her head slightly and gestured toward the printed guest list laid out on the table beside him. Long columns of names in bold black ink. Swiss, French, British, Canadian, she said aloud, scanning. Executives, analysts, investors, and middlemen. She ran her finger down the paper line by line. "But not one name from my village. Not one from the district the mines were carved from. None from the families who gave their lungs and limbs for numbers on your spreadsheets." Her voice didn't rise. If anything, it grew softer. "Not even one from the women who walked through poison rivers just to wash their children's clothes." Silence. The hallway held its breath. One of the journalists, a young woman with large glasses and a press badge that dangled slightly crooked, mouthed the word Aminata. And suddenly the name was no longer a whisper. It was a question spreading down the hallway like wind under a locked door. Who was she? How had they not seen? How long had she been here, walking among them? Unnoticed, a soldier near the door, tall, broad-shouldered, still too junior to speak without orders, took a small step forward. He didn't speak. He only looked at Aminata, then at the young officer, still holding the clipboard, like it might protect him. And in that gaze, something shifted. Not just rank, not just protocol, but permission. Aminata's finger hovered over the guest list like a judge preparing a sentence. Names flowed down the page in heavy black ink, Swiss, French, British, Canadian. Each one flanked by a sleek company logo. Some had initials like empires. Others had symbols, gold leaves, iron hammers, blue triangles. All sharp, all foreign. She ran her hands slowly along the list, her voice barely more than breath. No names from Tonghin, not from Kaya, not from Kudugu or Zorgo. Another pause. Her eyes narrowed. No names from my village. Not one. She looked up not at any one person, but at all of them. The officers, the staffers, the journalists, even the junior diplomat still holding the clipboard like it might shield him from her gaze. You built this summit for people who wear suits and carry briefcases, she said, but not for the women who carry water children and grief. The words weren't accusatory. They were factual, and that made them heavier. Silence thickened again. Behind her, a hotel employee with a service badge pulled his phone closer to his chest and began filming. Not for views, for memory. Aminata turned back to the list. You wrote this page like a map, she said. But my people, they are not on it. And that is no accident. The clipboard officer shifted uneasily, but still didn't speak. The soldier near the door finally looked away, not from shame, but from recognition. Something in him, something native ancestral ached. She lowered her hand, then glanced down at the marble beneath her feet. I was here, she said, when this building still belonged to their fathers. I was here when they brought in the imported chandeliers and we were told not to leave fingerprints. I cleaned these floors in silence while men negotiated our future in languages we couldn't answer back. Her voice trembled, but not with weakness, with memory. Flashback. It was the dry season. She remembered that clearly because the soil cracked when you walked like skin stretched too tight. That morning she had scrubbed the West Wing for hours. A foreign delegation was visiting British, she thought, or maybe Dutch. It didn't matter. Their suits smelled the same cologne over heat. She had stood to stretch her back just for a moment when her manager rounded the corner, a man with thin lips and a clipboard of his own. You, he barked. Why are you looking up? Keep your eyes to the floor. She said nothing. Too proud for your job, are you? Still, she said nothing, but her posture did not bend. That afternoon, she was called into the back office. No warning, no farewell, just a single sentence. We're letting you go. You carry yourself like someone who doesn't belong here. Back in the present, Aminata's voice softened. They said I walked too proudly, as if dignity was a threat. She took a breath. But I didn't stop walking. She looked to the soldier who had taken a step forward earlier. He met her eyes this time, not with hesitation, but with respect. I fed my son with scraps from the market, she continued. Bruised tomatoes, bits of cassava peeled from crates left behind. Some days we shared one mango between us and saved the seed like treasure. Her hands folded again in front of her, one thumb slowly brushing the back of the other, like she was calming the past inside her own skin. We had no bread some weeks, no candles for study, but we had truth. We had each other. And we had names they never learned because they never needed to. The journalist near the wall scribbled furiously, her pen nearly slipping from her fingers. This building still doesn't know our names, Aminata said, motioning toward the door of the summit. But I am not here to be remembered. I am here so they can no longer pretend we were never here. Behind her, the projector screen inside the ballroom still displayed the summit's title, Shared Prosperity Through Strategic Extraction. Aminata smiled almost imperceptibly. You call it extraction, she said. We call it disappearance. And for a moment, no one dared speak, not because they were silenced, but because they realized they always had been the ones refusing to listen. The murmurs in the hallway had grown from whispers into something electric, not loud, but undeniable. Something was shifting like the air before rain, thick, waiting to break. Aminata didn't move often. She didn't have to. She simply stood among them, no podium, no badge, no microphone, and somehow commanded more attention than the man on stage inside the ballroom, still clicking through a slide about regional yield forecasts. She reached into the folds of her worn shoulder bag again. Out came the envelope once more. Not a dramatic gesture, not theatrical. She simply held it at eye level, as one might lift a candle in the dark. The wax seal gleamed red and solemn under the ceiling lights. The presidential crest was now more than a mark, it had become a verdict waiting to be read. Her voice cut through the air like a clean blade. This is not noise, she said softly, clearly. It is consequence. The sentence fell like stone into silence, a phrase both quiet and thunderous. At the back of the room, the conference coordinator had returned. His tie was crooked, his earpiece blinking. He clutched a printed message in his hand and looked as if he had aged a decade since leaving 10 minutes ago. The journalist beside him turned toward the others. They verified it, she said barely above a whisper. The seal is real. It came from the president's office directly. Another staffer asked, when was it sent? The coordinator didn't answer. Instead, he walked to the junior officer, still holding the list, and said only 3 words. Let her through. The clipboard dropped to his side. All at once, the hallway fell silent, not in awkwardness this time, but in recognition. The woman who had scrubbed the floor, who'd been told to look down, who'd been fired for walking too proudly. She had just outranked the entire guest list. But Aminata didn't step forward. She remained still, the envelope still raised. Before I walk in, she said, I want you to understand something. They listened not because they were required to, but because they knew something rare was about to be spoken. She looked slowly across the faces before her. The aides, the guards, the analyst still pretending to check her email, the intern whose hand had stopped mid-text. Even the hotel cleaner, standing at the edge of the hallway, frozen mop and hand eyes wide. This paper didn't give me power, Aminata said. It confirmed it. Another pause. Then for years we were told to be quiet, told our pain was inconvenient, that our villages didn't count, our wells didn't count, our names didn't count. She lowered the envelope slightly. Now the land is bleeding, and the world wants to negotiate over the body. But we are still alive, and we remember everything. From the ballroom, someone opened the doors wider. Sound spilled out applause, a faint echo of Chart's voices discussing supply chains. All of it suddenly seemed distant, a different universe. The officer at the doorway stepped aside. Aminata looked to him. He didn't speak. He only nodded. And at last, quietly, with the calmness of someone who never needed permission, she walked forward. 1 step, 2. And as she passed through the door, no one dared breathe, because they knew what was about to be said in that room would not be like any speech before. This wasn't a guest arrival, it was reckoning. The ballroom was quieter than it had ever been. No one adjusted their ties. No one refilled water glasses. Even the air felt thinner, like the oxygen had been replaced with memory. Aminata stood just past the threshold, the doors wide open behind her. She hadn't walked in like a storm. She had walked in like a verdict. Every camera turned toward her. Every eye watched. Then came the footsteps, measured, crisp, coming down the side corridor fast but controlled, the sound of polished leather against stone tile. And then from the far side of the ballroom, the crowd parted. A man appeared, Colonel Issouf, Bomba Chief Liaison, to the office of the presidency, decorated, sharp. Known for his silence, feared for his precision. He walked with the posture of someone who only ever spoke when every word had consequence. He approached the center of the room. His boots stopped precisely 1 meter from where Aminata now stood. Then he saluted. Not a nod, not a half gesture, a full military salute. Sharp, crisp, reverent. Gasps rippled through the delegates. The CEO, seated at the front table, shot up from his chair. What the hell is this? Colonel Bomba turned slowly to face the room. Then he unfolded a short official letter marked with the seal of the presidency and read clearly, his voice cutting through the silence like a scalpel. By direct order of the President of Burkina Faso, Madame Aminata Urago is appointed honorary delegate of sovereign voice in this matter. She speaks with the full knowledge and authority of this office. He paused, then added, and she is to be shown the respect owed to the mother of the head of state. A few jaws dropped. One woman let out an audible, "Oh my God." Another delegate's glass slipped from his hand and shattered quietly on the carpet. The CEO stammered forward, eyes darting, sweat forming above his collar. This can't be," he said, laughing nervously. "This is political theater. It's optics. That envelope could have been forged. I mean, I've seen tricks like this before." He turned to the colonel, voice rising. "We've invested millions into this summit, into vetted participants. She's not even on the goddamn program." Colonel Bamba looked at him without blinking. "Sir," he said coolly, "I suggest you lower your voice when speaking to the mother of my commander-in-chief." The CEO's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Aminata hadn't moved, not once during the entire exchange. She didn't flinch at the applause. She didn't react to the salute. She simply stood there like time itself owed her patience. Her eyes swept across the rows of power brokers, men and women who had flown in first class, who wore lanyards like shields, who now avoided her gaze like it might burn. And then she finally spoke. "You built this room with microphones," she said, voice soft but even. "But when our rivers turned red, you didn't hear us." A slow hush rippled through the crowd, not from noise but from self-awareness. "When our crops failed from poisoned soil, no one printed it in your reports. When our children coughed blood, you called it regional vulnerability. When we protested, you called it instability. When we died, you called it margin loss." She turned to the CEO, now holding him in her gaze. "You call me not on the program? I was in your reports, just not with a name." Silence. Colonel Bamba stepped aside. "Madame," he said respectfully, "the podium is yours." And with that, the microphone, the same one that had amplified quarterly profits, mining forecasts, and foreign investment rhetoric, was now offered to a barefoot woman in a faded scarf. The CEO slumped back into his chair. His hands trembled as he reached for his water glass. No one looked at him. They were all watching Aminata, because something had shifted, not just in the program, not just in the room, but in history. The podium had been used by heads of conglomerates, finance ministers, foreign ambassadors. Now a woman with cracked sandals and a spine forged from years of silence stepped forward. Aminata Urago did not climb onto the stage she claimed it. The room had never been so quiet. Cameras turned like flowers toward the sun. Translators adjusted their headsets. Somewhere in the back row, the CEO pressed both palms against his temples, as if trying to hold his thoughts inside his skull. Aminata placed the sealed envelope beside the microphone. She didn't need it anymore. She was done showing proof. Now she would speak. She looked straight ahead, past the delegates, past the marble chandeliers, past the men who once laughed at her in doorways. Her first words were soft, but they dropped like iron. "You've mined our land," she said, "but never heard our stories. Not a single seat shifted. You've weighed the ground in grams of gold," she continued, "but never weighed the silence of our mothers. You've spoken of development while drilling through our graves." One woman in a navy suit pressed her lips together tightly. A military attaché lowered his gaze. Aminata's hands rested calmly on the sides of the podium. She didn't grip it. She didn't gesture. She didn't need to. Her presence was the gesture. "For decades we were not invited into these rooms," she said. "We served tea in them, cleaned them, waited outside them." She let the silence breathe. "Now we speak." It wasn't a declaration, it was a reckoning, a signal that the age of authorized forgetting had ended. She turned slightly, eyes sweeping the media tables. "This land is not poor. It was made poor by those who thought it was empty. But we were always here, with hands in the soil, with names that weren't printed, with histories that weren't footnotes. You turned our rivers into pipelines, our mountains into dust, our songs into static." Then her voice, still calm, became unmistakably clear. "As of this moment, by decree of the President, witnessed by this body, all extractive contracts not approved by sovereign village assemblies are declared invalid." The room gasped. The CEO stood abruptly, knocking over his chair. "You can't do that," he snapped. "You don't have the—" He stopped himself too late, because he realized the word he was reaching for had just died in his throat. "Authority." Aminata turned toward him, not with anger, but with precise sorrow. "You don't understand," she said. "We were never asking." And then she said it again for the world: "We were never asking." The crowd, frozen seconds ago, now shifted. Some faces turned pale, others thoughtful. Journalists typed madly. Lawyers whispered urgently into phones. And still she stood there unmoved. "The lands will be returned to their rightful stewards, not sold, not leased, protected. If you want partnership, come with clean hands. If you want investment, speak our language. If you want our gold, ask our children what they paid for it." Her voice softened again. "You can't claim justice while carrying silence in your briefcase." She closed her eyes for a moment, just one beat, then opened them, looking not at the room but past it, to the cameras, to the country. "This is not revenge," she said. "It's recognition. We are not ghosts. We are not myths. We are not victims you can quote in postscripts. We are here, we remember, and now we speak." No applause followed, not yet, because what had just been said wasn't a speech. It was a sentence served. And for the first time in decades, the room built to talk learned how to listen. The room was still absorbing her final words when the CEO rose from his seat again. His face flushed now, with something between disbelief and insult twisted into a crooked smile. It wasn't a confident one, more like a reflex, a shield made of arrogance, thinly stretched over panic. "That's quite a speech," he muttered loud enough for the room to hear. Delivered in worn-out sandals and a village shawl. A few chuckles, nervous, shallow, mostly from those who still hadn't realized the wind had changed. He turned slightly, speaking toward the rows of foreign press. "I suppose next time we'll all be negotiating in rags and parables. Who needs policy when you've got poetry and peasant stories? Still, Aminata didn't move, didn't blink. She stepped down from the podium with quiet grace, walking directly past the journalists, the diplomats, the men in designer suits. She paused only once, just as she passed the CEO still standing near his seat. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. You dress for power, she said, her eyes steady calm. I dress for remembrance. The words dropped like stones in still water, rippling outward with quiet force. This cloth, she continued, touching the edge of her faded orange wrap, was my mother's. She wore it the day the soldiers came, the day they dragged my husband from our doorway. She gestured to her feet. These sandals walked my son to school, carried water for miles, stood outside offices where no one opened the door. Now she turned to face the entire room again. This is not weakness. It is witness. No one laughed. No one dared to. Even the cameras held still, as if afraid a single motorized whir might break the gravity of her voice. You hide behind your fabric, she said softly now. Mine carry names. The CEO opened his mouth again, but no sound came out, because no one in the room was laughing anymore. The translator at the side booth wiped a tear discreetly. The young officer from the hallway earlier stood straighter than ever, his jaw tight with pride. A hotel server near the back dropped his tray to his side and whispered, Ma Aminata. As she walked toward the exit, the delegates moved aside, not ceremoniously but instinctively, like trees parting for wind. No applause followed her, just silence, heavy, deep, respectful. And that silence said more than thunder ever could. The doors at the far end of the ballroom opened quietly. No trumpet, no announcement, no sudden music cue or line of sharply dressed bodyguards. Just a man, tall, measured in his walk. The deep brown of his suit matched the earth of the very land he swore to protect. His tie was modest, no flag pin on the lapel. His face was serious but not severe, like someone carrying memory instead of ego. The people in the room didn't recognize him at first, not because they didn't know him, but because no one expected the president to arrive alone. But there he was, President Ibrahim Traore, not flanked by cameras, not surrounded by ministers. Just one man walking through a room heavy with stunned silence, making his way to one woman standing near the exit, his mother. Aminata had not cried during her speech. She had not cried when they mocked her. She had not cried when they saluted her. But as he approached just a few feet away now, her lips quivered almost imperceptibly. She didn't reach for him. She didn't run. She stood her ground like she always had. And when he reached her, he didn't speak right away. He just held out his arms. And she stepped into them. The embrace was long, unshaken, no ceremony, just something deeply human happening in the middle of a space built for political choreography. The president and his mother, the lion and the one who raised him. Click, click, click. Cameras began flashing. Photographers scrambled for angles. Aides exchanged panicked glances. Reporters whispered furiously into phones. Somewhere in Geneva, in London, in Washington, D.C., screens would soon light up with a single image, the president of a nation embracing a woman in a faded orange scarf and cracked sandals. But in that moment, the flashes didn't matter. He pulled back, looked into her eyes, and spoke softly, so only she and the microphones nearby could hear. Thank you, Ma. She blinked. Not for today, he added. For every day before it. Aminata's hand rose gently to touch the side of his face. Her thumb brushed beneath his eye, not to wipe a tear, but to remind him it was okay if one came. He turned to face the room, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. Now everyone was standing. From the foreign energy executives to the lowest-ranked aides, from military guards to local press, all rose without instruction. Not out of protocol, but out of understanding. And Aminata, she didn't bow. She didn't nod. She simply stood as she always had, unbent. A voice from the back of the room whispered, "He came alone." Another replied, "No, he came home." The president didn't speak into the microphone. He didn't need to. She had already said everything. Instead, he offered her his arm, not as a president escorting a civilian, but as a son walking beside the woman who had once fed him from market scraps and taught him to speak truth even if his voice shook. Together they began to walk down the center aisle of the ballroom, and this time no one blocked their path. Not a door, not a clipboard, not history. The president stood still for a moment after walking his mother down the center aisle. It wasn't hesitation. It was timing, the kind taught by fire not universities. He turned slowly his hand, leaving Aminata's shoulder with reverence, not release. Then he stepped toward the podium. There were no printed remarks, no teleprompter, no filtered speech approved by advisors. Just a man holding the weight of an entire people's silence and deciding at last to speak. He looked around the room. Every table, every delegate, every company logo stamped on plastic folders and polished name tags. Then into the microphone he said clearly, effective immediately, all foreign extraction contracts in Burkina Faso are suspended pending review by sovereign community councils. No one breathed. The words didn't just ripple, they detonated. One woman from the EU delegation dropped her pen. The translator froze mid-sentence. The American executive's brow creased like collapsing metal. And then from the front row, the inevitable, "This is madness." The CEO snapped, rising from his seat so fast the chair screeched behind him. You can't just tear up years of bilateral investment frameworks with a sentence. We have legal rights, protection clauses. This violates international. He stopped only because President Ibrahim had turned his eyes on him. Not angrily, not with heat, but with absolute clarity. "This isn't a boardroom," the president said calmly. "It's our home." A long pause. "And if someone has been robbing your house, you don't invite them to the table, you change the locks?" Whispers surged through the room like wind before a storm. He continued. "These contracts were signed in English, French, and German. Never in Mossi. Never in Fulfulde. Never in the voices of the people who live where the earth is being torn open. We were told it was mutual benefit. See, that's hard to believe when we have children dying next to rivers that shine with chemicals." He didn't shout. His voice stayed even. "To the companies in this room, if your projects are ethical, you have nothing to fear. But from now on, your legitimacy will come not from what you sign behind closed doors in capital cities, but from what the people of Kaya and Zinjare and Sapui say to your face." Another silence. This one not stunned, but awakening. The CEO stepped forward again, sweating now. "Mr. President, if you do this, you risk sanctions. Retaliation. You're gambling your economy. Your GDP," President Ibrahim cut him off, "not with volume, but with precision. I'm not gambling, I'm remembering. The economy you speak of, whose economy is it if it doesn't feed its people? You say I'm risking the nation, but we've already paid the cost. With lungs, with silence, with soil. Now you will wait. You will speak to elders, to mothers, to farmers. You will not dig one more inch without listening first." In the back of the room, a woman from the press lowered her phone slowly. On her screen was a live stream already surging past 1 million views, comments pouring in. Finally, a president who sounds like his country. "Burkina Faso just woke up the continent. This speech will be remembered for 100 years." Outside the building, crowds were beginning to gather. Some had watched on phones. Others had heard rumors. A few didn't even know why they were pulled toward the gates. They only knew something old had ended, and something right had begun. The president stepped down from the podium. No bodyguards closed around him. No aides rushed forward. He walked toward his mother again. She didn't say anything. She only took his hand lightly, briefly. And that was enough. Because when the order was spoken, it didn't echo through the chamber. It echoed through history. The cameras were still rolling, but no one was looking through their viewfinders anymore. Even the journalists had stopped typing. Something had shifted, not in the headlines, but in the air. President Ibrahim remained near the podium, his voice quiet now but rich with finality. He turned back toward the audience. His gaze swept across a room full of people who moments ago thought they were in control and now sat like children hearing a story they almost forgot. He lifted one hand, not in command but in memory. "She swept this floor," he said, eyes settling on his mother, who stood near the wall, not taking the spotlight, not claiming anything. "She swept this floor with a rag and a bucket, while others plotted futures she would never benefit from." A pause, and now she has swept out the lies that lived here. A quiet murmur passed through the crowd. One by one, people began to nod. Some clapped, tentatively, at first uncertain if this moment was sacred or public. But soon the applause grew, not thunderous, not orchestrated, but genuine. Not for a policy, not for a headline, but for truth. Aminata didn't react. She didn't bow. She didn't smile. She didn't raise a hand or take a theatrical step forward. She simply stood the same way she had stood before soldiers, before poverty, before silence. Unshaken, unassuming, like dignity disguised in plain cloth. She glanced around the room just once, and her eyes caught on one thing, a young janitor, barely 20, standing near the edge of the back wall. His mop stood like a spear beside him. His uniform was faded, and his name tag had a corner torn off. He was crying quietly, shoulders barely moving, but not from sadness, from recognition. Aminata gave him a single nod, nothing more. But the boy straightened like someone had handed him a sword. She then turned, walking away from the spotlight, past the rows of chairs, past men who now stood for her, past a CEO who couldn't meet her eyes. And when she passed the exit doors, she didn't look back, because she didn't come for applause. She came for truth, and she had said it. Outside, under the early afternoon sun, people had already begun gathering in the square. Women from the market, drivers, teachers, soldiers out of uniform, children holding cardboard signs scrawled in charcoal. Her name is Aminata. Some carried no signs at all, just quiet awe. Others whispered to one another with urgency, retelling what they had seen as if passing down scripture. She told them to speak to the elders. She wore her mother's wrap. They tried to mock her, and she stood taller. She said, "You dress for power, I dress for remembrance." Inside, the president let out a quiet breath. Not exhaustion, not relief, just release. The hearing was held not in a grand hall, not under chandeliers or surrounded by security gates. It was under the shade of a neem tree. The air was thick with heat, but no one moved. Not because they were uncomfortable, but because something sacred was unfolding, something that had not happened for generations. People were being asked to speak, not to plead, not to protest, just speak. Wooden benches circled a modest platform made of 3 old tables pushed together. No microphones, no translation headsets, just a small recording device donated by a student from the Capitol. Aminata sat in the 4th row, slightly to the left, not in front, not on stage. Among the people, she wore the same faded orange scarf. Her hands were folded gently in her lap. Her presence alone calmed the noise of memory, like a stone held firm in a rushing river. An elder stood up first, not to speak, but to call the others forward. "Today we listen to each other," he said. "Today we do not ask others to hear us. We hear ourselves." And so it began. A girl no older than 15 took the first step forward. Her feet were bare, her voice shaking. They said they needed the land for a road. They built a fence instead. She held up a piece of torn paper, a school certificate, half burned, half legible. They said the school would be moved. It wasn't. "I haven't studied since." Her eyes flicked to Aminata just once. She didn't need a reply. She needed a witness. Next came a woman wrapped in a loose blue wrap, her back bent from years of carrying wood in silence. "My husband left me this land. I still have the deed," she said, pulling out a crumpled page wrapped in plastic and tied with twine. "But when I took it to the company, they told me it didn't exist. They brought machines 2 days later." She didn't cry. Not anymore. That part of her had already dried up, but her hands trembled. "Now I live beside a pit. My goats fall in, so do my memories." Then came a man who had not spoken publicly in 20 years. He had once been a teacher. Now he built fences. He cleared his throat, holding nothing but a bent metal spoon. A symbol. "This spoon fed children who learned under my mango tree," he said, until the dust from the trucks coated their books in red. "I stopped teaching because there were no children left to teach." One by one they came. A boy whose river turned blue. A grandmother who was called witch when she asked for medical reports. A young mother who gave birth beside a mining truck because the clinic was gone. A farmer who still spoke to his crops even though they hadn't grown in 5 seasons. No one interrupted, no one corrected, no one defended. They just listened. Even the younger officials sent by the new administration sat still, their tablets, closed their pens down. Because what was said here didn't need to be measured. It needed to be remembered. Near the back, an old man leaned toward his grandson and whispered, "I never thought I'd see the day the land heard us back." Aminata didn't take the floor. She didn't need to. Her presence was enough, like a drumbeat under silence. But as the last story was told, a little girl not more than 6 walked up and handed her a small stone. "For your pocket," the girl whispered shyly, "in case they forget again." Aminata closed her hand around it slowly, and as the wind moved through the neem tree, the leaves didn't rustle. They nodded. The third day of community hearings was held beneath the same neem tree. But something had shifted. The benches had multiplied. So had the people. Some came from villages nearly 30 kilometers away. They brought with them baskets of cassava photos in plastic sleeves, old tax receipts, and most importantly, stories they had waited years to tell. By now, Aminata was known not just as the president's mother, but as something quieter, sturdier, like a wall that wouldn't fall no matter how hard the wind pushed. She still sat among the crowd, not in front, not on a raised chair, just another body listening. But when the murmurings of uncertainty grew, when some younger attendees wondered whether speaking out was safe or wise, she stood, slowly, and said only this: "This is not a courtroom." The murmurs stilled. "This is not judgment. This is memory returning." She turned slightly, speaking to no one and everyone. "What we say here doesn't go into case files. It goes into the ground, into the air, into the hands of children who need to know where they come from." She paused and her voice softened. "We don't need lawyers to tell us what happened. We were there. We buried it with our own hands. Now we dig it back up, not to hurt, but to heal." A silence followed, not awkward, but full. Ready. The testimonies resumed. A former midwife stood up. Her face was lined with both age and memory. "They built a road over the path women used to reach me in labor," she said. "Now babies are born in bush, in cars, in silence." A teenage boy stood next. He didn't look up as he spoke. "My brother died in the quarry. He was 14. They said it was his fault. He didn't wear the helmet. They didn't say there were no helmets." He held out a photo, a crumpled print, half faded. "I kept this," he whispered, "so I wouldn't forget his name when they kept saying numbers instead." Then came the elder. His beard was white, his walking stick carved with family symbols. He walked slowly to the center of the circle, leaning heavily, but his voice clear, precise, unbroken. "You children speak well," he said, eyes sweeping the crowd. "You speak with fire, with truth. But remember," he turned to Aminata, "you carry not just your name, you carry ours." He tapped his chest, then the ground. "You speak for the buried, for those whose names weren't written but were lived." He looked around. "That is not a burden, it is an inheritance." A single tear slipped down Aminata's cheek. She did not wipe it. Behind her, a woman passed forward a bowl of water. Ritual water drawn from a spring that had run dry twice in the last year. As the bowl moved from hand to hand, no one drank. They dipped their fingers in it, touched their foreheads, as if to say, "We remember." Because this indeed was not a courtroom. It was older than that. It was truth given shape, not by verdict, but by voice. The 7th hearing had just ended when a group of unfamiliar vehicles pulled up near the edge of the village. They were clean, dustless. 4-wheel drives armored with tinted windows and quiet engines. The kind of cars that didn't belong to farmers or teachers. The kind that once never stopped here unless they needed something. Out stepped 3 men and 1 woman in corporate attire, their shirts crisp, shoes polished. One of them, a man with silver cufflinks, carried a leather binder against his chest like a shield. They didn't walk with arrogance, but with calculation. Eyes lowered, pace careful as if crossing a river whose depth they couldn't guess. The village council met them at the tree. One of the delegates spoke first, his voice flat. "You've come late." The woman nodded gently. "We know." The man with the binder cleared his throat. "We are here to apologize," he said slowly, "and to request space, to renegotiate with full transparency, with community involvement." He paused, waiting. No applause came, no celebratory chants, not a single cheer, just nods, some cautious, some cool, some simply tired, because this was not a celebration, it was a correction. The elder from the day before stepped forward, his walking stick tapping the earth like punctuation. "We will listen," he said, "because we are not like you. When we say peace, we mean it." And then he turned to the people gathered. "But we will not forget." The officials nodded again quietly, then took their place not in front, but at the edge of the circle. And life resumed. No banners were raised, no headlines declared justice won. There was no parade, no slogans, no speeches, just movement. A woman stood from the side of the circle arms, filled with loose papers, property records, handwritten testimonies, weather-stained photographs. As she struggled to keep the pages from blowing in the breeze, Aminata stepped forward without a word. She knelt beside her, one hand gathering the papers, the other holding the woman's elbow steady. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. It was a gesture older than politics, a truth deeper than law. Help quietly, hold gently, stay present. Around them, the children ran again toward trees, not trucks, toward sun, not fences. The elders murmured. The drums stayed silent, because today wasn't for noise. It was for beginning. The sun had barely risen when the car from the National Museum stopped in front of Aminata's home. It wasn't large, just two curators in a faded government vehicle. One carried a slim leather folder. The other held a carefully wrapped display box lined with velvet. They were nervous. She was not. Aminata stood in her doorway, hands tucked into the folds of her orange scarf, faded now, but still bright enough to remind anyone watching that memory, like fabric never loses color, only shape. The younger curator stepped forward first. "Madame Aminata," he said, voice formal, rehearsed. "We are here to ask if you would consider donating your wrap in your dress to the national exhibit." A pause. "We believe they belong in the People's Hall, next to the Declaration of Land Rights. The public wants to remember you." Aminata looked at the dress she wore. The same cotton threads that had once walked the president to school, the scarf her mother had passed to her before the soldiers came, the same outfit the world saw when she walked into that conference without a badge, but with the truth. She smiled, gently. "You want relics," she said, "but these are not relics." The curators exchanged glances. "These are reminders," she continued, "and reminders belong to people, not glass." They hesitated. She watched them carefully, the way a mother watches children handle something fragile without knowing. But she said finally, her voice like water over stone, "I will give them on one condition." The older curator straightened. "Anything, madame." "Don't just tell them what I wore," she said. "Tell them what it meant. Tell them I wore my mother's grief and my son's promise. Tell them I wore silence stitched into strength. And if anyone asks whether this is history, tell them no. Tell them it is ongoing." She folded the scarf herself, slowly, deliberately, then laid it into the box like a prayer being returned to the sky. The curators bowed not out of ceremony, but instinct. And when they left, she stood in the doorway, no longer wrapped in orange, but surrounded by it just the same. A week later, Aminata walked to the edge of her village with a group of children, each holding a small wooden bowl. Inside each bowl sat a scoop of earth. They followed her in a quiet line. No drums, no ceremony. Just dusty feet, big eyes, and the giggles that always come with the waiting of something new. At the clearing, there was a hole already dug. Not deep, but ready. Aminata reached into her satchel and pulled out a sapling thin green, with roots wrapped in wet cloth. "Baobab," she said. The children whispered the name like a spell. She knelt slowly. Her knees creaked, but her hands were steady. "This tree will not grow fast," she said. "It will take many rains, many dry seasons. But when it grows," she looked at the tallest boy in the group, "it will outlive all of us." The children grew quiet again. One small girl, maybe 7, stepped forward and tilted her head. "Will it be big?" Aminata smiled. "Yes," she said, "if you water it when no one's watching." The girl furrowed her brow. "Why when no one's watching?" Aminata leaned closer. "Because anything worth growing needs care that isn't for show." Together they pressed the dirt around the roots. The boy brought water. The others took turns touching the leaves. One child sang. Another drew a circle in the sand around the base. No one told them to do it. When they left, the sapling stood in the wind, just tall enough to be bent, not broken, and Aminata stood behind it, her hand brushing the bark like it was the forehead of an old friend she had yet to meet. Weeks passed. In the capital city, a girl no older than 8 stood in front of a glass case at the National Museum. Her class had been noisy all morning, laughing at drums running past ancient tools, but here in this room they were quiet. Inside the case, a faded orange wrap, a simple village dress, a pair of cracked sandals, and a photo. Aminata standing at the podium, eyes calm, voice immortal. The little girl stared up for a long time. Finally, she asked the teacher beside her, was she a queen? The teacher knelt beside her. No, she said. She was greater. She was a mother. The little girl blinked. Who's ours? The teacher pointed to the plaque below the glass. The girl read aloud slowly, carefully. We do not wear power. We carry it. The girl didn't speak after that, but when her class moved on, she turned one last time and smiled, as if the cloth inside the glass had winked. Sometimes power doesn't arrive in suits or titles, it walks in quietly wearing worn-out sandals and carrying decades of truth. Aminata's story reminds us that dignity isn't granted by status, but lived through courage, sacrifice, and love. In a world obsessed with appearances, she showed that those we overlook often carry the weight of nations. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was history waiting to be heard. What quiet strength have you witnessed in your own life? Someone who didn't speak loudly but changed everything. Let's honor those voices not after they rise, but while they're still beside us. If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share and subscribe to Captain of Truth, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Captain of Truth.